It's always such a pleasure to have Jordan Chariton back on the show. One of the most important independent, intrepid journalists of the moment of our generation who has doggedly pursued very important stories long after and before the mainstream media decided they were significant enough to be of notice. And I really appreciate him coming back to the show to talk about his new book, We the Poisoned, exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up and the poisoning of 100,000 Americans. Welcome back to the show, Jordan.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You also, of course, are the founder of Status Coup, one of the most important, as I mentioned, news outlets that does original reporting in a space that really is filled, and I'm not helping, but filled with more commentary than there is reporting. So can we start just by giving us a sense of what it's been like to do kind of gumshoe reporting at this moment? We're in the middle of a truly overwhelming news cycle with Israel breaking the ceasefire. I mean, it has been doing so throughout, but with these strikes that happened over the course of last night, with Trump rounding up people for deportation without any due process, including an American citizen who got swept up in this on the basis that he was Latino and walking around. He had his ID on him, and that didn't help. There's so much going on from so many different angles. How are you managing this all right now?
Not well. Trying to, but there's only so many hours in a day, and Status Quo, like a lot of the indie outlets, is pretty under-resourced compared to the bigger outlets. We've always kind of tried to balance covering news of the day, which, as you just said, is dizzying right now, and it's very hard to keep up with also owning a lot of stories that are falling through the cracks. So that's kind of been the tug of war, particularly during Trump 2.0, is trying to cover the onslaught. I mean, between the mass deportations, now him just, saying I'm going to deport anyone that's against, U.S. foreign policy. He casually said yesterday, I'm going to release 80,000 JFK documents, which I'm particularly interested in. And obviously the gutting of agencies is in that, and trying to stay on our typical beats. We've been covering a massive lithium battery plant fire that happened in Northern California. Very few people know about it. Another East Palestine type situation. Residents are sick as far as 50 miles away. And on those type of stories, the community relies on you as an outlet because very few other outlets are covering it. So it's kind of that yin and yang of trying to stay on news of the day, from Gaza to the explosion of protests. We covered last week the big veterans protest. Then the next day we covered a big protest in New York City against these government cuts. I was out in New York covering protests outside Tesla. It's been, we're always busy, but it's been extremely busy between news of the day and covering those other types of stories that others are ignoring.
I'm sort of envious, Jordan. I mean, I spend so much time sort of online and watching your coverage specifically, and any other sort of man on the street type, direct evidence I can get about what the tone and temperature of the country is, because otherwise you're just watching MSNBC pundits and like Matt Iglesias launder whatever, poll has come through the transom to suit their abundance agenda, or, be the basis of some article about how the country has to move more to the right, et cetera, et cetera. And, I can be wrong in my sort of political priors, or I should put it differently. I should say my political preferences aren't necessarily reflected in the interests and priorities of the public, but I don't know that. We can't know that in any real way without the kind of work that you do. So I am curious, like, for example, can you give us a sense of what the vibe was like outside of these Tesla plants that keep getting attacked? Elon Musk took to Twitter to describe these attacks as terrorism.
And he backed me, and he went, and he got very much involved. He thought he actually would go around saying, if Trump doesn't win, our country is over.
But do you consider this an act of domestic terrorism?
I think so.
Why?
I think that if and when they catch the people, and I hope they do, the good thing is they have a lot of cameras in those places, and they've caught some already having to do with that. I think that you will find out that they're paid by people that are very highly political on the left.
As you mentioned, the idea of domestic terrorism has been used to justify stripping Americans of due process rights. What are people saying about it on the ground?
I was pretty stunned, actually, because I've been all over the Bernie Woodstock of 2016, Trump rallies, Hillary, rallies, then did it again in 2020. So I've kind of been to the wine mom circles, to the Bernie cave, to the Trump madness. And outside the Tesla, a lot of it, I mean, I didn't, card everyone to ask them their priors, but I did get a vibe that these were a lot of Hillary types here. It was kind of the meatpacking area, downtown New York City. Traditional libs, there was a good amount of older folks and younger folks, but there was a good amount of older folks. So I was pretty surprised when I interviewed them. I mean, I didn't meet one person that had anything nice to say about the Democratic Party, including card-carrying Democrats. I met several that seemed to me by their vibe and disposition might have been, typically a Hillary person or a Biden person or a lesser of two evils person, but were saying Bernie's the only one doing anything. So I was kind of surprised that there was such not only ire at the Democratic Party and the kind of corporate neoliberal types that these folks typically support, but they were also saying good things about Bernie. They said good things about AOC. They were not only upset about the gutting of government, but the corruption. And I pushed back. I'm glad to see you're upset about the corruption, but isn't this a more brazen form of corruption that was already kind of in the shadows before? And some of them conceded that. So I do think you're seeing that spreading around, and there has been other reports from reporters covering these Bernie, the Bernie tour against oligarchy, that a lot of folks there, of course, are, longtime burners, but there are also a lot of more normies now coming out.
Yeah, I'm sure you saw the clip of, was it Chris Coons sitting down with John, Stewart? Too many Johns in the podcast world. With Jon Stewart, basically admitting that, Bernie is the only one with energy and Bernie's doing the right thing and Bernie's showing the leadership. And I tweeted about this, but I personally, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I don't know what to do with that energy at this juncture, because I, like some people on the left, not everybody on the left, but some people sort of see this as a version of a cycle that we get where after it's too late to do anything about a given problem, there is a willingness to acknowledge that the left maybe made a point. But by the time the next election season rolls around, you get people closing ranks again around Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris or whomever it's going to be. And so I personally have an unwillingness to be especially hopeful or optimistic that the acknowledgement that, hashtag Bernie would have won, or Bernie reflects the mood of the country more so than the Democratic Party, will have staying power as opposed to just being used to sheep herd people back into the fold.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a threading a line when I'm out there, because you don't want to beat people over the head like, hey, I told you so.
Yeah.
I guess better late than never. But at the same time, you also don't want that back to normal energy circa 2020 Biden. I don't think the answer here, as horrible as what Trump and Musk are doing, and it's horrible, I think it's way more corrupt than even the day-to-day corruption, dime a dozen corruption under the Democrats. But with that said, I don't think the answer is let's just get back to normal. We got to get rid of these people and let's get Pete Buttigieg in there to restore sanity. No, we've done that. And that cycle just leads to a fascist in 4 years, because you bring back the normie corporatist Dem, they give the masses crumbs and people get angry again. And we have these boom bust economic cycles. So I think right now, and, with the Bernie tour, it's great, but I personally think what better opportunity to talking about and advocating for a new party, a third party, when you have Republicans out there turning against Republican congressmen. I mean, these are like rock-ribbed conservatives at some of these town halls that are speaking out against Medicaid cuts, Social Security cuts, laying off of government workers. They are not lockstep with Musk, Trump, or any of this. And on the other end, you got normie Democrats speaking out that you folks are spineless. You're not fighting hard enough. I think Tim Walz. There's some things I would that I would take issue with, but he's coming out saying, yeah, no, this is not a time to be talking about strengthening Obamacare. People are not going to stand for that. We need Medicare for all.
Look, I hear the thing out there is that when we get back, which we'll fight. I'll tell you what people are going to expect is they're not going to expect us to tinkle around the edge with the ACA. They're going to expect universal health care. And if there's a lesson here, I always said this, we had a 1-vote majority in Minnesota when we moved clean energy, we moved reproductive rights, we moved a whole slew of progressive, very popular, including things around guns and gun safety, very popular things. We moved it with a 1-vote majority. And people ask, well, what do you call a 1-vote majority? A majority. Simple as that.
So to me, I'm glad to see both on the right and the more liberal side, people are fed up. But what happens tomorrow if, fingers crossed, the Supreme Court actually does the right thing and says Doge is illegal. All of this was illegal. We need to reinstate with back pay these workers, and kind of this urgent crisis point ends. Or if the answer can't be all of these people out protesting, the normie Dems, the Republicans go back to sleep and are okay with the dime a dozen corruption in this country. So I don't know the answer, how you reach those people, but I personally, and I'm sure you have thoughts as a veteran Bernie staffer, I just wish as his last legacy, he'd be out there using this moment not to feed back people into the Democratic Party, but to chart a new path.
Yeah, from your lips to God's ears. Because also, look, even if it were just, four-dimensional chess, if Bernie's ultimate goal was to influence the Democratic Party, he does so more effectively the more adversarial he is. And you can't get much more adversarial than being willing to be outside of the party altogether. And historically, obviously, he has done this to some degree as someone who has been an independent for all his time in Congress. But that extra additional step of saying, yes, I'm willing to not just support sort of like Justice Democrat style insurgent candidates who are primarying incumbent Democrats, but people who are fully outside of the party is deeply, deeply frustrating. To your point about Tim Walz saying, modifying Obamacare isn't enough. Again, I'm a little bit hopeful about those sorts of things. I think Chris Coon said something similar to John Stewart, that tinkering around the edges isn't enough. That does seem to be a shift in rhetoric that I can acknowledge, I'm not going to deny. But also, without an actual commitment to saying I support something like Medicare for all, it does suggest to me that you're basically saying we're going to do this much more tinkering. What is it actually that you are considering to be the substantive change in policy? Because at the end of the day, if you understand that there was corruption, if you understand that the Democratic Party was not reflecting the needs of the electorate, and you're willing to say that now, but you don't have an analysis of why it was that 88% of Democrats want Medicare for all in almost no elected Democratic representatives will do the same. If you aren't willing to talk about the fact that whatever is good in their hearts and minds and what their spirit would compel them to want and what they'll actually do because of who their donor base is, our intention, and you're not willing to resolve the underlying driver of what politics are in America, then what am I supposed to do with this? I don't want to see an angry scold all the time who's not willing to acknowledge that rhetorically some things are going in the right direction. But honestly, I've been around the block. What am I supposed to do with this rhetoric? Prove it to me. I'm open to it being, proven to me. But saying the right thing for a 7-minute segment to Jon Stewart, it's not sufficient.
I just think politically speaking, you don't have to be a consultant or a strategist to see where the wind is going. I think whomever comes out first, not only with hey, we need to put the fire out message, return us back so normalcy could come in, but we need to offer a bold alternative. whether that's Medicare for all, free public college, massive trillions in investment in clean energy, renewables. Do something about this. I mean, the oligarchy that we're now seeing, the AI, the predatory AI. AI could be used for good, but clearly they don't want to use it for good. I mean, they've been open that they want to replace jobs. I mean, whoever is going to come out, and Walz so far has kind of tinkered. Chris Murphy, to a lesser degree, the senator from Connecticut, who's kind of been a traditional establishment guy, but he came out after the election saying, hey, Bernie was kind of right, and maybe we should start listening. Whoever's going to both say we need to put the fire out, but also, offer a bold vision, I think they would win a landslide. Because Trump, contrary to this mandate baloney, he did not win by a lot. He did not win a crushing mandate. He won. But if you look at the exit polls data, it was the economy. It was inflation. I don't think the core reason he won is over immigration based on being on the ground. It sure seemed to me that most people who are not diehards like you and I just looked at it and said, hey, things were cheaper. I don't love them, but things were cheaper, so I'm going to go back to that. So that's not hard to beat if you're offering something different. And let's look also, I mean, the Luigi Mangione phenomenon, contrary to the media spin, is not simply because he's a good-looking guy. I mean, I've seen old ladies outside the courthouse for him. I've seen healthcare reform activists.
Old ladies can still be attracted to a good-looking young man.
Right, that's true.
Don't count us out. LOL.
But I've seen this story. I've been doing this for 15 years. I have not covered a story where the left, the right, the outrage is coming from everywhere. And it's mostly not towards him. It's towards the predatory health insurance industry. So I think that there's a real opening now for a truly populist candidate. And Tim Walz, he's done good things in Minnesota. That can't be denied. He did it with a 1-seat majority. He didn't blame the parliamentarian. So whether it's him or somebody else, but I think right now is a real opportunity. But I do see a danger, and I don't, to my audience, I don't want to jump on this and only cover Trump, but tacitly, we have to be clear as leftists on the commentator side, but also the reporting side. The answer is not going back to like Clintonism, Obamaism. That's what has got us into this mess, to be clear. That's what has ushered in a used car salesman reality TV show to dominate politics for the last decade.
Yeah, and sorry, you're right. It's Chris Murphy. I kept saying Chris Coons. Can't keep my congressional Chris's correct. You mentioned the Trump promising to release the JFK files. It's worth noting that he said he was going to do so during his first term. He was in fact president before. It was they were under like whatever kind of embargo existed for a certain number of decades, and that time happened to lapse while Trump was president during his first term, and he did not release them all, obviously. And with the debacle that happened with the Epstein files, I got to say, me personally, I'm very skeptical that we're going to get much, if anything, of note. That being said, the timing of it also does seem to feel like throwing chum to the masses. I see conservatives, including people like Green. Oh, Jesus Christ, what is going on with my brain today? Three
Marjorie
names
Taylor
Green. Sorry.
Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Yeah, exactly. I've seen conservatives like Marjorie Taylor Greene tweet saying, hey, we wanted America first, not to be starting additional wars around the world and in the Middle East. This isn't what we signed up for in the wake of the latest assault in Gaza. And I do wonder if this feels to you like it does to me, like a sort of a distraction to feed the base while Donald Trump continues to betray his own campaign promises.
Yeah, I think on a daily basis, you could find distractions with him. Folks are getting pissed off. The polls are showing the eggs are too damn high. So he deports, 200 gang members, whatever he's saying. And it seems defies a judge. And then, on a whim, we're releasing the JFK files. So, I mean, this is his pattern. He does this constantly, just kind of flood the zone, as Steve Bannon says. You have to take everything with a grain of salt. I'm very skeptical that he's going to release some type of smoking gun related to JFK. Obviously, the Epstein file release felt like a lead balloon. But I think he is trying to distract the masses. I think he's he's got the pulse on his own base, and you kind of see when even they're starting to question some things. It would take a lot for them to break from him, but he likes to kind of change things up, throw spaghetti at the wall to excite them if there's something that they might be bothering them. Even his base is saying, there's folks saying, you're not really focusing on the economy. That's why, that's what we wanted here. So I think what you're seeing with, deport people on a whim in these mass deportations or the JFK files, now calling to impeach judges. The next day, we're going to take over Greenland. It's all to kind of throw so much out there that it exhausts both allies and enemies at the same time. It's an effective approach, but at the end of the day, if he actually sticks with these tariffs, I mean, Carville was right 30 years ago. He hasn't been right since. It is the economy, stupid. And I think his base, if prices go up, I don't see his base as otherworldly patriots that are going to be okay with like $15 eggs so that we could, have a trade war. I don't see it.
Yeah. And I'll just read this Marjorie Taylor Greene tweet for posterity. She says, I have not heard a single American say they want another war in the Middle East or anywhere else. Not one. All I've heard is a loud cry demanding our government and its leaders, all caps, put America first. I don't support going to war on behalf of other countries. I support peace and fixing our own massive problems for our own people. It's literally my job title, U.S. representative. I know, I'm sorry, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but the way that this entire piece lane is wide open for the Democrats to occupy if they were interested in doing so, but they cannot because they're equally tied to Israel, is mind-boggling. And obviously this was a choice leading up to the election, and it became very clear, and polls have subsequently demonstrated that a significant portion, the largest single issue that motivated 2020 voters not to come out for Biden in 2024 was Gaza, with 29% of those voters saying that was the issue that made them not want to vote for him a second time around. And so the choice was made to pick Israel and genocide over winning an election and defeating the fascism that Democrats have been hand-wringing about for years, since 2015. And now we're seeing it again. It's here. Everything and worse the Democrats imagined is here. And still there is an unwillingness to occupy this space. You mentioned the kind of occupying Greenland story. There was similarly an occupying Canada story, or making Canada the 51st state. And some weeks ago or months ago, when these issues first started percolating, it seemed like more of this sort of chum to the base, like weird symbolic stuff that Trump was saying as a show of power. There was the renaming the Gulf of Mexico. All of this seemed part and parcel of the same thing. But I watched you conduct one of your interviews, and your focus on water, generally speaking, and the Flint water crisis, and focusing on water wars issues with that particular guest made me start to think a little differently about whether or not there was a broader geopolitical game at foot with respect to both the Canada story and the resource that is the Great Lakes, which I believe are the largest body of fresh water in the world. And also Greenland, for both its sort of position with respect to the Arctic and how shipping lanes are opening up in the Arctic as ice caps melt, and because of mineral resources that are newly available in Greenland as a consequence, again, of global warming. Can you speak to whether or not you think there's a there outside of Trump just being Donald Trump when he's talking about renegotiating the border with Canada?
Oh, when it comes to Canada, it's very clear that Trump wants to steal as much of Canada's water as possible. We do share the Great Lakes, which, for those that don't know, the Great Lakes, we share 4 of the Great Lakes with Canada. One of them, Lake Michigan, we have complete control over. But the Great Lakes provides 20% of the whole world's fresh surface water. Some of the cleanest water in the world. And we share share it with Canada, but Trump has complained now to former Prime Minister Trudeau that, you have too much. It's not fair, even though we control more of the Great Lakes than Canada. We control 60,000 square miles. They control 35,000. But essentially, Trump, there's a lot of different reasons he wants more of Canada's water. Number one, obviously, we've had drought in America. His solution for it with releasing dams in California, which the water did not go to LA, is not the right solution, but we do have drought. So he wants more water from Canada, who, by the way, Canada has 2 million freshwater lakes, 13 river basins and lakes are straddling our border. So there's a lot of water in Canada he wants access to. Based on what I could see, you need a lot of water for AI, which his administration has.
Is that to cool the
Yeah, so you need a lot of water for AI to cool the servers. You need a lot of water for these data centers that you need for AI. Similar, by the way, for crypto. Crypto uses a lot of water, but AI, you need a whole lot of water for the data centers, and he wants the United States to be the AI capital of the world. You need a lot of water for hydropower, which is, when water's moved, turning it into electricity. So dams, it's a cheaper, one of the cheaper forms of energy. Hydropower has been along the U.S.-Canada border. Water has been used for hydropower plants. You need a lot of water for fracking. He's talking about drill, baby, drill. You need a whole lot of water, raw water in particular, to frack. That was actually one of the causes, which we'll get to, of the Flint Water Crisis, and a lot of water for manufacturing. So auto plants, steel plants. If he's actually serious about bringing industry back here, I don't think he is, but his stated goal. So there's a lot of different reasons you need water. At America, we've had water shortages and water aquifers running dry. We've seen it recently, not just in the Southwest. Folks focused on the Southwest, like LA, New Mexico, but there's been issues in Virginia at a military base that had a water shortage recently. Florida has had water shortages. So there's a lot of reasons he wants water, but essentially, if you look at wars throughout the 20th century, they've been fought over oil. With climate change, drought, some experts have said you could be seeing wars fought over water, and Trump thinks water was not part of NAFTA. So, and water on Canada's side is not controlled federally by Canada. So different provinces in Canada create treaties with America. So it's not one treaty between Canada and America over water use. It's several different treaties with different provinces in Canada. So essentially Trump's saying, hey, we already control most of the Great Lakes, but we want all of it. And I actually think that's more of what is behind his, whatever you want to call it, dream of making Canada the 51st state, to control all the water, among other things, because, like I said, there's a whole lot of different things you need water for.
I don't mean to sound naive, but there's a lot of water in the Great Lakes. I know everything's a finite resources, and if the world truly starts to crumble the way, it very well might, I can appreciate, not morally, but sort of geopolitically, the value of having absolute control instead of partial control. But I'm having trouble understanding, okay, there's water shortages at a military base in Virginia. You want to occupy Canada to take all of the Great Lakes? It's a lake. I'm sorry. I know I'm going to sound silly, super naive here, but you can't, whatever you want to draw out of it, draw down on it. You're concerned that Canada's population, that's 1/10 the size of ours, is going to disproportionately somehow empty the lake of its water and draw down resources in a way that precludes America from using it the way it needs to or wants to. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. So the Great Lakes Compact, which was formed in the late 2000s, basically has limits on how much diversion you could have and how much water you could draw out of the Great Lakes. So even though it seems like an infinite supply, that why do we need Canada's water? We have it here. there's limits,
Sure.
which Trump doesn't seem to care about limits to other things, but there's limits to how much water we could draw out of the Great Lakes for, manufacturing or AI or all the things I just talked about. So that is why I think he's trying to get around the limits to the Great Lakes water supply here in America by basically saying we need to renegotiate. So the 30% you have, we want, 15 or 20. So there are limits because on the surface, it does seem like, don't we have enough water from the Great Lakes, et cetera? He also just ended, it's not just the Great Lakes, he just paused the Columbia River, the negotiations over the Columbia River, which starts in British Columbia on the western side of Canada and goes into Washington State and Oregon here over similar reasons, basically saying that he wants to basically move the boundaries so America has more of it, is the simplest answer. He wants to either take Canada to be America or change the boundaries so America has more of the water, because in his mind, which doesn't typically understand how this works, he thinks, hey, let's not do anything about the actual source of the drought, which is carbon emissions, the climate fossil fuels. Let's just get more water from the Columbia River in British Columbia for the drought in California. But that's not going to stop the burning of the planet. That's a Band-Aid for a gaping gunshot wound. So it's not just the Great Lakes. He just did that. The Biden administration, there was kind of an impasse between the Biden administration and Canada over the Columbia River Treaty. That was that started in 1961, that treaty between British Columbia and Western states. But again, that is a major water source that Trump wants access to for hydropower plants and, drought, because he's saying, hey, we have these wildfires because of forest management and, we're not tapping. He called it, I actually have it here. He called the Columbia River a very large faucet that they have a very large faucet that we should utilize up there in Canada.
Cool. I mean, when you talk specifically about the water being used for AI and cooling servers, one part of my brain is like, well, obviously this is the choice to, do AI is obviously generating a lot of emissions that are driving climate change as well. But also it is very evocative of exactly what happened in Flint. This idea that some kind of industry requires clean, high quality water raises the concern that clean, high quality water will be prioritized for profit seeking of one industry group or another. And human beings are going to have to default into a lesser quality water supply. For people who don't remember exactly what set off the Flint water crisis, can you take us back to that decision point?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people, based on the media's crappy reporting, think Flint was just some tragic mistake because government officials were trying to cut corners and save money. It was actually a privatization scam. So the very long story short, Flint got its water from the Great Lakes we're talking about for 50 years. It came from the city of Detroit. Detroit pumped it out of Lake Huron, which is one of the Great Lakes. Detroit treated the water, added the chemicals that are added to water to make it safe, and then piped it to the city of Flint, 70 miles. And there were no quality problems. There was just Flint and locals in Genesee County, which Flint is part of, were complaining because Detroit kept raising Flint's rates. So it was really not a water quality issue as much as you're price gouging us. Flint folks were saying Detroit. And there was a lot of corruption problems in Detroit and the Detroit Water Detroit Water Authority. So folks on the ground, I mean, this is dating back to before the water switch. They had visions of, well, why don't we create our own water system in Flint? So we're not reliant on getting water from Detroit. We'll regionalize it, meaning take control away from Detroit and create a regional water pipeline, which essentially was code for a privatized water system. So they came up with the brilliant idea, brilliant is sarcasm, let's create an identical water pipeline coming out of the same source, the lake, going the same exact path of the existing Detroit water pipeline and going to Flint. The only difference would be the Detroit water pipeline that gave Flint finished treated water, So by the time it got to Flint, the water plant didn't really have to do much to it. It was ready to go to customers. The pipeline, the privatized pipeline was going to be raw water. Well, what do you need raw water for? We spoke about some of those things. At the time, the Republican governor wanted to frack the hell out of Michigan. That was a big natural gas push. You need a lot of water for fracking. Also, they were openly saying this is going to explode the blue economy. So similar things to what we're talking about. More of the water for this new pipeline was going to be used for industry rather than residents, for meat packing, the auto industry, steel plants, manufacturing plants that need water. So the pipeline was billed to the people of Flint. This is going to save you money compared to the rates we're paying in Detroit. But there was a problem. Flint in 2013, 2014 was broke for a lot of reasons. The offshoring of jobs. If you've seen Michael Moore's Roger and Me, you could see Flint was at one time, the bastion of the American middle class. The auto industry was born in Flint. But for a lot of reasons, by the turn of the century, it was a rotting economic corpse. In 2013, 2014, it had no credit rating. It could not legally borrow more money. So an unelected emergency manager that was appointed by the governor. So democracy was canceled in Flint, like actual democracy being canceled, not what the Democrats have been warning about. An unelected emergency manager, along with some kind of local players and the governor, they came up with a fake emergency to allow a nearly bankrupt Flint to borrow $100 million to help fund this completely unnecessary privatized new water pipeline. And once they did that, which criminal charges were filed based on that fraud, they said, hey, while we're building this new water pipeline, which is going to take about 2 years, we'll save money by just using the Flint River. If you lived in Flint, you knew the Flint River had been dumped in for like 100 years. General Motors dumped its waste, Dow Chemical, DuPont. I mean, residents joked to me when I got there, like they dumped bodies in there. It looked green to me the first time I saw it, very polluted. So they said, let's use the polluted river and let's use the Flint water plant, which had not been used as a full-time water treatment plant in half a century. Let's use this plant to treat this polluted water. And as my book details, it was essentially the equivalent of these Boeing planes falling apart midair and saying, just get the plane and we'll get it up there and we'll add the parts as we fly. So that's what happened. The plant was missing crucial equipment. It was quoted as needing $61 million in upgrades before switching to the river. They didn't make those upgrades. They didn't even have the proper equipment to add the proper chemicals for safety. And within weeks, residents were receiving water that was brown, smelly, kids with rashes, people's hair falling out. And what came next was what I've been covering and investigating for almost a decade now. One of the biggest government cover-ups of the 21st century. I think this makes Watergate, which was the 20th century, look like nothing because nobody died in Watergate. It involves the EPA, the state of Michigan, the local city of Flint, the county. You have Wall Street banks involved. So essentially a privatization scam for an unnecessary water pipeline poisoned this city. And one thing I left out real quick, they didn't have to switch to this new water system. The city of Detroit didn't want to lose Flint because Flint was its biggest water customer. So the city of Detroit at the last minute offered Flint a nearly 50% discount. So like go to the mall, everything's half off. Flint would have saved money if it just stayed on Detroit's water, but it was never about saving the residents money. It was about making money, banks making money who were issuing the bonds, landowners who mysteriously purchased land along the route of the pipeline, and industry who was going to get cheaper water.
I mean, Jordan, to your point, this is not it's been an ongoing tragedy. It's not a new story. You've been covering this for almost a decade. And yet when I was reading this, I was struck by the level of detail, the amount of corruption. I mean, it reads like the Lincoln Lawyer. It reads like almost like a crime thriller, because of how layered and despicable the actions taken are, and because of what the scale of the tragedy, frankly, is. The family that you open with, and what they went through is such a powerful way to frame the story and reintroduce the human element, which I fear has become diminished over years of people becoming sort of inured to the reality of it. So I wonder if you can take us back to that moment where you were first sitting around the table with this family and they were recounting to you their experience of first realizing there was something wrong with the water.
Yeah. And that's, as a journalist, that's kind of the balancing act. It's like you have this avalanche of facts, and a lot of those facts are just corruption, and you need to break it down. But you also don't want to erase or leave out the human part of this, because that's what matters. So many people have died. Cancer is surging now 11 years later because the effects of heavy metal poisoning, lead, a lot of other things that were in that water. It takes, especially lead, it takes many years for the full effects. So the human tragedy, it's not in the past. It's ongoing now. People are dying. People are getting cancer. And one of the families you talk about, the Murphys, so they had moved to Flint a year before this happened. So very bad luck. And they started noticing that their dogs in 2015 weren't eating, 2 dogs. One of them was losing a lot of weight. Took them to the vet. You know, who's thinking it's the water? And a blood test showed that they were just awash in lead. One of their dogs also had stillborns giving birth. And then...
And the wife was pregnant at the time.
Yeah, her Adam's wife, Christina, was pregnant. And then, you know, local media was not covering it a lot. So they just happened to read an article about people bringing jugs of brown water to City Hall, and it dawned on them it's the water. And Adam, like, I think his wife was holding ice cubes to put in his kid's drink that summer, and like said, you know, it's the water, put everything down. So that's how they first realized it. And it just got worse and worse from there. It started with the dogs, then Adam, who was in his 30s, you know, having seizures, complete memory loss, driving. He's 3 blocks away from home and he has to call his wife. I forget how to get home, 3 blocks away. He could no longer work in his mid-30s. Christina is pregnant. So imagine just you're already a pregnant woman, hormones and the normal anxiety. On top of that, she's now scared that her kid's going to have, you know, born with heavy metals and lead. So what happened was Adam went to a town hall at the beginning of 2017. At that time, the mainstream media wasn't covering it anymore. Rachel Maddow had parachuted in, but she was gone at this point. And he kind of flew off the handle because the government wasn't really doing anything. They were spending more money on marketing and PR to claim it was all getting better. But houses hadn't been tested. Residents were getting flimsy filters for their water, but not like core help. So he flew off the handle. And at the time, the governor, you know, that's when the sirens went off. Anytime activists or residents would get media attention and showing that it's not getting better, they would act. So all of a cop removes this father who's having seizures and can't work anymore and says, I might know somebody who could help you. And 3 weeks later, the governor's right-hand man, in terms of like a Sopranos character, I would call him the consigliere to the boss. The governor's right-hand man is in his living room, flanked by a state trooper on his right, and on the left, a former Army colonel. Could be perceived as intimidating, and
could be.
Yeah, essentially offers, you know, they're desperate at this point. They're sick. The kids also were having issues too. So offers to pay for Adam's medical treatment, expensive treatment called chelation to remove lead from your body. But shh, don't tell anyone where it's coming from. And if it works for you, we're going to offer it to all of Flint. And through my reporting, I found out that the governor's right-hand man was going around town offering these special deals, i.e. payoffs, to the most kind of the loudest residents, the ones who were speaking out too much, getting media attention. So when we talk about corruption, it's hard to keep up, like we talked about at the open. There's so many crises, but this is corruption that kills, because the Republican governor and his administration were literally spending more time covering up the mass poisoning that they inflicted on people than trying to make it right. So
to be really clear, like, payola is bad enough in and of itself, but you're telling people to be quiet about what's happening to the entire community, or else they might not be able to survive. They're leveraging medical treatment and their ability to survive and to save the lives of their loved ones and their family to stay quiet about what's happening to someone else's loved ones and their family in the community. I mean, it's one of the cruelest, darkest, lowest scenarios, frankly, I can imagine in a political sphere.
Oh, it's morally depraved to the 10th degree. And this guy, I mean, another example, which almost like you would think comes off like a dark comedy. Richard Baird found out that there was a resident going around town holding, like, flashing around a corroded pipe. Richard Baird was the governor's right-hand man. So he found out that this resident was going around holding up this corroded pipe in town halls, at community meetings. So he contacted the resident and said, hey, I'd love to meet with you. I'd love to take that pipe back to the state lab to get it tested to see what's in there. He just jacked the pipe. The resident called him and spoke to his assistant and said, he told me he was going to give it back to me. And the assistant was like, oh, yeah, it's been on his desk for like weeks. So that's the kind of characters we're talking about here. Offering, sick, vulnerable people essentially payoffs, but keep quiet. You can't, and, stop rabble rousing at town halls and just keep quiet. Neutralizing folks that are going around. I mean, I saw the inside of this pipe. It was disgusting what it looked like. And, destruction of evidence after the governor finally acknowledged that the water was awash in lead. This was in 2015, so a decade ago. Like a week later, all of a sudden, a bunch of phones belonging to environmental officials, health department officials are just dumped off to the technology department, completely erased. I mean, just think MSNBC's reaction if, like, Trump's administration, their phones were erased or, whatever. That's what we're dealing with. They just erased phones. There was no messages on them for the entire period. Flint was using the Flint River, so you couldn't really see who knew what when, who was talking about this. You also had, between the payoffs, destruction of evidence, witness tampering, trying to basically, before witnesses were going to talk to investigators, get them to lie. There was a really dark story. Full disclosure, I'm trying to turn this into a movie, so hopefully if there's some filmmakers watching.
I was going to ask because, the audience, that Aaron Brockovich wrote the introduction, and so many of the scenes that are described, Mrs. Murphy dropping the ice cubes when she realizes it's the water. It makes me think of that scene in Aaron Brockovich where the woman runs out to get her kids out of the pool. They have like an above ground pool, and Aaron comes to talk to them about what has been going on with the health concerns of their family. I mean, I haven't seen this movie. I haven't seen Aaron Brockovich probably in 20 years, but that is seared into my brain. And as I'm reading this and as I'm talking to you, I can't help but think that realistically speaking, the way that you're going to get the most eyes on it and have the most impact and to kind of inject this back into the public consciousness would be to make it a film. And it's ripe for that. Yeah.
I mean, I won't drop names, but I spoke with one filmmaker recently, and the tug of war is also between, like, this is 11 years later, and will people still care? And I basically made the point you made. I mean, this is not just some, like, it is the story of human tragedy, but this is really like, I wrote this as a true crime thriller because it really is true crime. I mean, this is destruction of evidence. I mean, you have. I didn't get this in the book, but you have one tale where residents had dropped off 1,000 water bottles to the governor with messages in the bottle. They're desperate. Help us. Mm-hmm. This was in 2017. Mm-hmm. The governor immediately tells his people, get it out of my office. I have video of his person literally burning these water bottles in burn barrels. Can you imagine that? Like, poisoned residents, just so happens to be poor people, majority people of color, get rid of these bottles with messages, and they're burned in a barrel. I mean, that's the kind of moral depravity we're talking about. And you also have, I mean, I will never forget this. People ask me, why did you stay on this for so long? It's in the book. I mean, I was just knocking on doors for one story, and a mother was sitting on a front porch with her 1-year-old on her lap. And the closer I got, she had kind of white sores and blisters all over the baby. And they had just moved into the house like a month before. Skin was completely clean. But obviously the mother was bathing her 1-year-old in the Flint water. So now she has all these white rashes and blisters. And I mean, they were poor. It was a poor family. The governor had just declared the water restored, shut down all the free water stations so you could no longer go to the locations that were around Flint to get free bottled water. 20% of Flint doesn't even have transportation. So they were relying on home delivery. And she said, I'm considering calling Child Protective Services on myself just to get water. Because she's calling 311. You can't get through to anyone. And they can't afford to buy cartons and cartons of water. Like, this is happening in America, and the media doesn't cover it. I mean, the media basically stopped covering this right after 2016 because they moved on to the Trump show. So that's why I covered it and continue to cover it, because it's not just about water. I mean, it's a massive, deadly cover-up, because not everything is like COVID, where you could see the real-time death count on CNN, at the worst of it. When we talk about Gaza, that's an in-your-face genocide. Like, the bodies are piling up. But to me, and I don't use the word lightly, this is a slower-moving genocide, because we do not know how many people have died because of this. When the state put out a total BS number, but you have people dying of all sorts of cancers at young ages with no family history. You have people dying of kidney failure, liver failure. You have people dying of rare diseases for which they have no genetic disposition. And that's not officially marked related to the Flint water crisis, but they were relatively healthy before this. So I have built sources that every time I go to Flint, another person that some of them who I grew close to have died. And we're not talking about like 70s, 80s. We're talking about 40s, 50s, 60s. So this is a slower moving form of genocide. And unfortunately, we're seeing similar things now in East Palestine. There's other communities that had different, the inciting incident that caused it might have been different than Flint, but the playbook that was used to cover it up in Flint is basically being copied in those communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have stories every other day about, there's a plastic spoon's worth of microplastics in your brain. Like, and people get concerned, rightly so. We're all switching out our plastic cutting boards. I'm paying over $3 per organic bell pepper because we're all in this sort of low grade panic about these kind of environmental concerns. But the structural aspect of it, like a lot of the coverage ends up being about like your consumption choices, like so many other things. And at a certain point, it starts to feel like overwhelming, in part because it's not individual consumption choices. You can't protect yourself from it when it's literally coming out of your tap water and in the air. And we are a society and we live in as a community. If we don't act that way, it starts in a poor community. They get away with it more egregiously in a poor, disproportionately non-white community. But ultimately, it comes back to get us all. And I wish it didn't require that sort of broadening it out and connecting the dots and making people understand that our fates were all connected to care. But regrettably, I think that is exactly what's required. While you were talking, I was thinking about how I went to a family wedding in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania some years ago. And my mother remarked that like everyone she talked to at the wedding had cancer or had, known someone in their family who just died of cancer or was a cancer survivor. And this is a community, the family of the bride it's near 3 Mile Island, right? These are all people at this wedding that live their whole lives downwind from 3 Mile Island. And these catastrophes happen that are genuinely news headline grabbing catastrophes. And even those get sort of yada yada away in the grand scheme of things. You mentioned East Palestine, and one thing that struck me was how for a period of time, not a long enough period of time, but for a period of time, the right's interest in sort of politicizing that event as one in which the sitting president didn't show sufficient attention to the residents and didn't come to visit and all of those other kinds of things, did keep the spotlight on it for a period of time. And I do wonder if you look at Flint and the sort of bipartisan F-up that was involved, and Obama being the president at the time, and, you know, participating in that pantomime of drinking the water and all of those kinds of things, affected the longevity of the news story and folks' willingness to continue to talk about it as it continues to affect the community all these years later.
Yeah, I think there's two major problems when it comes to these stories. Number one, like you said, a lot of it becomes tribal. So, for example, in Flint, in East Palestine, the right was interested in it. They had the mayor of East Palestine talk at the RNC when Biden was president. Now that Trump is president, I mean, J.D. Vance, who represented Ohio, went to speak at East Palestine on the 2-year anniversary and did a total reversal on everything he said as senator.
Really? What is he?
Oh, yeah.
What is he saying now?
Well, he called for a disaster declaration in East Palestine as a senator. A reporter asked him when he was there as vice president, "Are you still calling for that?" And he kind of backed off of it and said, "Well, I don't know if it's necessary." 2 years later,
one of the things that they tell us, News Nation, is that they want a federal disaster declaration so that federal funds can come in so that they can get Medicare and they can get long-term health monitoring. I know the previous governor, has asked for this. When I spoke with you last year, you asked President Biden to sign this. Will the Trump administration declare a disaster here so people can get these resources that they need?
Yeah, so the long-term health monitoring, by the way, is something that we're very focused on, and I'm personally very focused on. It's something my Senate office worked a great deal on, and frankly was very disappointed that the Biden administration wasn't willing to meet us halfway there. We're going to do a lot there, and I think there's a lot that could be done. On the disaster declaration, it's an interesting question, because a disaster declaration may have been very helpful 18 months ago. I don't know that it's still helpful today.
Maybe I'm not a good student, but if you as a senator 6 months ago called for a disaster declaration, why do you now 6 months later as the vice president need to ask behind you if you still need a disaster? Why did you say it needs a disaster 6 months ago, but now that's an interesting question? I have never heard a more bullshit statement by a politician. I could tell you, because I've been there multiple times, it is necessary. And a disaster declaration would basically bring in the federal government. So you could have FEMA, you could have the Army Corps of Engineers. People could get access to Medicare on the ground there. Biden did not issue a disaster declaration, just like Obama did not issue a disaster declaration in Flint. They basically hide behind the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act says that essentially, if it's not a natural disaster like a tornado or a hurricane, we can't issue a disaster declaration. There's lawyers and experts who have said you can. It's a disaster. But putting that aside, the right said nothing when J.D. Vance went to Flint, East Palestine, and basically said everything's fine. He said the testing's showing things are better, and he talked more about economic development in East Palestine. You know who was pissed off at J.D. Vance? The residents of East Palestine in Western Pennsylvania, who happened to be mostly conservative. They were pissed off. I didn't see coverage. Steve Bannon went to East Palestine with his little war room. He didn't tell that side of it. He didn't criticize J.D. Vance. So we see too much of this where if it's my team presiding over it, we give certain benefits of the doubt. But if it's the other team, full steam ahead. And that's just wrong. We're talking about life or death here. It's like water is one thing. I would hope we could just our water, our air, our soil, our kids, our elder, whoever is causing it or covering it up or not doing the right thing, we should hold them accountable. So tribalism is a big problem. And the other problem, which I don't know if we have enough time to talk about, we have a horrendous media in this country. We have a mainstream media that I think it's a mix of laziness as well as corporate interests that do not want to stay on these stories. Even when a lot of these stories, frankly, are stories of a lifetime, it could win your reporters all sorts of awards. There's corruption just lying there for you to sink your teeth into. I mean, I love the people of Flint, but I don't consider it a vacation spot. I've been to Flint 21 times because I've had to go 21 times because the Michigan media was not covering it and the national media was not covering it. They might do a story on the anniversary and that's that. So essentially, perfect example, on my way to Flint for my book event, I stopped in East Palestine. I interviewed a couple in East Palestine. And after, the woman said, you know, I got to tell you, I just thought Flint was better because I never heard about it in the news anymore. That's just generally how people look at things. You know, a lot of people are wising up to that. I think mainstream media's influence is diminishing. But I would say normies, if they don't see anything covered anymore, they just assume, oh, it must be getting solved or, you know, out of sight, out of mind. So when you have a media that really it's a system meant to build narratives and build conflict and create urgency rather than actually cover the oppression, exploitation, poisoning. I don't use that word dramatic, but that's what's happening. When there is no incentive or they don't see an incentive in both covering and staying on those stories, the masses forget. Because who the hell could remember crisis from 3 days ago? With podcasts and TikTok and social media, we all only have so much attention span. That is supposed to be the role of the media. I mean, CNN, the New York Times have quadruple the resources little old status quo does. But we manage to cover a wide breadth because when there is a will, there is a way. They choose not to. And I also think there's a big problem when media is consolidated in New York, D.C., and frankly, consolidated. Do I think diversity is a problem in media among skin color, among gender? Yes. But I also think there's also a diversity of problem of experience. We have too many people who went to like Northwestern and have a master's in journalism. I'm not knocking you for that, but we don't have as many people in journalism that are from the working class, that aren't in New York or D.C. I have talked to producers and lower level reporters at mainstream outlets who told me I fought to go back to Flint, I fought to go to East Palestine, and my boss said no. Or I got the green.
This is an interesting aspect of the book. I didn't realize about you, Jordan, that you had previously been a booker for some of these big corporate media shows, Fox and MSNBC, was it?
Mm-hmm.
So you have experienced the phenomenon of trying to pitch a segment that is actually worthwhile and newsworthy and covers the local news that doesn't get covered as much because of the consolidation that you were alluding to. And being told, no, sorry, I respect the vibe, the idea, the morals behind what you're trying to do here, but it won't sell, basically.
Yeah, that was kind of my last straw at MSNBC. MSNBC is in Rockefeller Center, and it's just, when I worked there, it was just surrounded by homeless people. So I said to my boss at the time, this is what MSNBC was like pitching that whole lean forward thing. Spike Lee had done a campaign for them, Lean Forward, and it was a lot more progressive than it is now. It was not like Bush apparatchiks. So I pitched my boss. I didn't even pitch myself on camera. I just said, hey, why don't we go out there and speak with homeless people? Obviously respect them. If they don't, that's fine. But get their stories, because there's a lot of folks out there that are formerly middle class, are not like the stereotype of the homeless. And he kind of like patted me and was like, that's really admirable of you. But those days in journalism are long gone. That won't rate, I was told. And I just said, you know what? At this point, I could have risen at Fox or MSNBC, either on air or behind the scenes, done well for myself. But I didn't want to cover the same two bullshit stories on a loop over and over again. So it was just very clear to me, whether it's Fox or MSNBC, sure, it's a different ideological propaganda, so to speak. But at the end of the day, it's infotainment. It's not news and journalism. And the outlets that have done news and journalism are few and far between. And I think a lot of people wrongly, because I've had people tell me, when I'm talking to them about status quo, it's great that you do that, but most people don't want what you're doing. Most people want that, conflict and sensationalism. And I said, there's a difference between what most people want and what most people are fed, because there are algorithms, including where we're talking now, that, basically drive certain types of content to the masses. So I have I read the comments as much as I can under our videos, and the most common theme is, why have I never seen this? You're the exact channel that I want, but why have I never seen your channel? I have viewers that watched me when I was at the Young Turks 7 years ago, who just find Status Coup and think I just suddenly came out of a retirement or something.
Yeah,
don't
me
realize.
Too. I have people from Rising who are like, it's nice that you started your new show.
No. There's a lot of algorithmic, obviously there's capital C censorship where they're just removing people, but there's also shadow suppression. And if you do a video, on Joe Rogan or TYT or, the Kardashians, it'll do well. If you do a video on a lithium battery fire in Northern California, it might sneak through 1 out of 10, but most of the time it won't. And that's a tough choice for most people, to willingly make less money, get less clicks. And there's been a lot of moments where I didn't know if we were going to be able to keep the lights on because we weren't generating enough clicks or views, or we weren't reaching enough new eyeballs to then convert them to sign up as paid members. But, at the end of the day, I think you gotta be able to look in the mirror. For me, it's important that what I do has a purpose. So I'm glad that, we are growing now, having a growth spurt. But the Flint stories and the East Palestines and all these types of stories Status Coup covers, and you cover when you can also, they're not about one thing. It's about capitalism. It is about East Palestine happened. Not a lot of people think it's because the train derailed. The people are sick, not because the train derailed, because a multi-billion-dollar railroad company was allowed to detonate the cars after. So that's why people are sick. The EPA allowed a billion-dollar corporation to unnecessarily nuke the town. So this is not just...
And the choice of even where to route the tracks to begin with. Railroads, they call it the wrong side of the tracks, the bad part of town, for a reason. Railroads are allowed to run through lower income communities because of precisely the risk that rail presents, and the kinds of things that are carried on these trains present to communities. That's not going through downtown. Highways and trains are not going through Westchester.
No. I mean, hell, talk to Native Americans. Between the uranium mines, Standing Rock was exactly what you just said. The pipeline was supposed to go through Bismarck, North Dakota, which is whitey white town, and they rerouted it because the white folks said no. So I've covered chemical plants that are dumped on top of black neighborhoods, high cancer. And now, East Palestine, that railroad is right on top of a poor white community. So it's going, it's race, but it's also class. And now you had mentioned it. It's not exactly the middle class and wealthy are not escaping either. This lithium battery plant in Northern California, that's Monterey County. Average household income of $98,000. It's not a poor area. And that lithium battery plant, which, obvious presidential hopeful Gavin Newsom rammed through, because in his clean energy goal, he rammed that through in Northern California, right next to what is known as the salad bowl of America, because 70% of our vegetables are grown there. And what do you know? When lithium burns, the fire department can't put it out because lithium is reactive to water. So you have to let it burn.
Christ.
So that fire went on for days. It's 2.5 months later. People are still sick. Nosebleeds, chemical burns. A pregnant woman I interviewed was 1,000 feet from that. Her kids were sick.
Every incident that has occurred has to do with, the sprinkling system failed or water came in the ventilation. This is not our first fire, guys. This is our 4th fire. And they've all had to do with the infiltration of moisture. We live in a marine layer, not just a marine layer of moisture, but salt water specifically, which is highly conductive in batteries. This is not, new. This is elementary physics. This is what we learned in elementary school.
very severe fatigue. Like when you come here, you feel fatigued, you feel tired. I think that there is, obviously some kind of political, financial, hand-in-pocket agenda to, quiet the reality of the short and long-term health symptoms or complications in order to essentially restock those batteries as soon as they can. So if you look here on the outside, you'll see there's like this blackish tone. I don't want to touch it.
And the independent testers found high heavy metals in the soil. It's like the Twilight Zone. My wife and I were shopping the other day. We're getting strawberries, and I'm anal about this because I cover it. I said, no, we can't get those strawberries because they're from their farms right next to this plant.
Oh,
Everybody else in the store have no idea about it, so they're just getting the strawberries. So I even texted my sister-in-law because my niece loves strawberries, and I said, don't get this brand because there's soil contamination.
Christ.
But the masses do not know. So sometimes I just feel like I'm shouting into a void because there's so many horrible things. And, the normie Dems and the normie libs think all of this started under Trump. No, this has been a cascading 40-year corruption. When you have, I don't agree with my old boss on many things, but Cenk has said it right. We have a system of legalized bribery in this country. And it's killing people, some acutely and some later on.
Well, Jordan, you certainly aren't shouting into the void. I rely on your reporting, as so many others do. And I say on this show as frequently as I can and give plaudits as frequently as I can to people in the space who are doing original reporting, whether it's you or whether it's David Sirota and the whole crew over at The Lever, or Ryan Grimm or David Dan or whomever it is, all of these people that I've learned so much from, and without whom this whole left media ecosystem would crumble into internecine fights between podcast hosts. And I am so grateful for it. You're reminding me of, I've mentioned this. I don't know that I've ever talked about it in real detail, but like at Rising, it was this constant sort of negotiation of headlines and clicks, right? Like for myself, I'm really grateful to I make my money on Patreon, not on YouTube. So I like when YouTube videos do well because I think there's opportunities to bring in new viewers. And I think the content is important. So obviously I'm happy that more people see it. But I'm not as, hooked into the influence of what the algorithm is like asking me to do to actually get clicks. If a video gets 5,000 clicks, it doesn't really matter to me. But at Rising, it's like I'm there as the left chair and I'm trying to launder the things I want to talk about through the lens of, is this going to get enough clicks so that next time an issue like this comes around, I'm not shot down in the pitch meeting, right? Like, so I'm picking my battles. And I'm trying to figure out constantly how to frame things in a way that'll get clicks and get us the headline. Bill Maher, and I get to respond to Bill Maher, right? Joe Rogan, and I get to disagree with him or just use a little Joe Rogan clip in a bigger point that I'm making. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get important issues to fly. And that's part of why I brought up this, the Republicans making a political issue out of East Palestine. It's not entirely, I'm not really saying that as a criticism. I obviously am frustrated that Republicans like to complain about things and never follow up and help the people that they're ostensibly advocating on behalf of. But the trick of getting people to care about people's toxic reaction to a train derailment by making it about blaming Biden, I'm not necessarily mad at if it were to get the job done. So as you're talking and you're like, Gavin Newsom, presidential hopeful, a person who's everyone's mad at right now because he's spending all his time on this new podcast and interviewing Steve Bannon. And not just, I agree with interviewing people, by the way. I would have Steve Bannon on, but just agreeing obsequiously with Steve Bannon is the problem. And Charlie Kirk and all the others. He's someone like that to me, there's an opportunity there, for people, conservatives and leftists alike, to say, I hate Gavin Newsom, he's poisoning America. He's not he's not fit to run the country. And to tell the story through that lens and to get that headline and that click, you mentioned all of the vulnerable constituencies, including the elderly earlier, that are at risk. And in my head popped Cuomo and the fact that this man really honestly thinks he can come back into politics and run for mayor of New York after killing thousands of people's grandmothers in the middle of COVID. Like, it is, you're completely right about the algorithm, and it sucks that I have to think about how to label this video. Jordan Chariton, independent journalist, slams former producers at MSNBC, to try to get eyes on it. But like, I do think that there are growing opportunities for that precisely because more and more people are willing to be critical of both establishment parties as they fail the public in increasingly dramatic and unforgivable ways. So I'm not surprised to see that you're having an upswing in viewership right now. It is incredibly deserved. And I really encourage people to, if you aren't already subscribed to Status Coup, to subscribe, click on videos, leave comments, leave likes to help boost in the algorithm. And even if you think you know everything there is to know about the Flint water crisis, I promise you don't. And this doesn't read like, so many, nonfiction books that, sometimes I have to struggle through, the audience. I joke a lot about how I'm more of a podcast listener than a reader these days. This really does read like a crime thriller. And I found myself, frankly, overwhelmed at times by the depth of the corruption that happened and is ongoing, the drama, tragedy that is ongoing in Flint, Michigan. And I'm so grateful for you for writing this book and for doing all of the work that you do over at Status Coup.
Thank you. There's an audio version too, if people like listening.
Oh,
yeah.
Fantastic. Well, you should have told me that. I could have gotten it in along my hot girl walks over the past week. No matter. It got done either way. Jordan, as we wrap here, tell the audience where to find you and anything else that you want to leave them with today.
Yeah, Status Coup, C-O-U-P, on YouTube. We are covering the Gaza protests. We're covering the chaos under Trump and a lot of these other stories of what I call corporate sacrifice zones. So if you want news of the day, but also news that's falling through the cracks, go to Status Coup. If you can support us financially, statuscoup.com/join. And my book, you should be able to find it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, also audio book, so Audible. And there's also a documentary we did last year, free, flintfatigue.com. So we went back to Flint for the 10-year anniversary. So that's a full-length documentary. It actually won 2 film festival awards last year. And it kind of shows in the name Flint Fatigue how the country has kind of, or politicians specifically, abandoned Flint despite the ongoing crisis. So you could watch that at flintfatigue.com.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today and continuing to support independent media in whatever ways you can, even if it's honestly retweets and likes and comments. Those kinds of things really do push in the right direction algorithmically. So thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for supporting independent journalism like Jordan's and like Bad Faith Podcast. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.